Welcome to Sharks, Snakes and Shareholders, an Innovators Uncensored show where startup founders and entrepreneurs share their horror stories of shady term sheets, toxic boardrooms, and investors you wish you declined. Each week we'll have a new guest, ranging from angel investors and VCs to deal makers and founders, who will rank each of these horror stories on our investor red flag scale. Hosted by ShipShape.VC's very own Daniel Salko.
Hi, I'm Daniel Safko. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ShipShape.VC, a free-to-use investment search engine that enables founders to identify which investors they should be speaking with about the technology that they're building. We're really pleased about this show because it helps founders identify the horror stories that other founders have gone through without needing to repeat the same mistakes themselves. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tom Saunderson, who is a partner at Browne Jacobson, who are a law firm. Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. So I am a corporate lawyer. So I advise primarily on transactions, so sort of pre-seed right through to exit, really, and sort of incentivizing staff and all that sort of stuff that comes with shares.
And worth mentioning as well that Tom, prior to moving firm, was actually our lawyer. So you helped us with everything from our initial documentation through to later rounds, and always been a great sort of source of advice. So thank you. And thank you for putting up with myself and Alistair and all of our weird and wonderful questions that we were like, I really hope Tom doesn't charge us for this.
My pleasure.
But yeah, it's been a lot of fun sort of growing the business and being able to sort of tap you up for advice when we needed it. So thank you for that, Tom. Okay, first story I think this is really interesting. When I got this through, I was like, oh my goodness me, this should be front page of a newspaper somewhere. And actually, worth mentioning before we crack on with this story, I'm going to do a little plug. So if you're a founder and you've got investor horror stories that you'd like to share with us, please get in touch via the link below. So we were introduced to an investor through government when the government found out that this business was raising. The investor that was introduced then actively followed up, stating that there was a strong interest in the technology that this founder's business was developing. And another very interesting signal here, so the investor that had been introduced asked how much would be needed to fill the whole round, and said that he'd need to check with his wife, but that this was potentially doable as they both made regular investments. I think this is where things start going down a particularly colourful route. Investor then mentioned other opportunities for working together and seeing where there's combined value. So mentioned that there's a virtual reality aviation project that you want to work both these businesses to work on together. However, founders started sort of like picking up that this was a strange opportunity when the potential investor mentioned that they were intending to land flying electric vehicles on public streets with absolutely no flight restrictions at all, or indeed sounds like health and safety either. Gets even more colourful where that investor, and I think credit to the founder here in terms of like sort of drawing this out from this investor, but this investor was also trying to convince the government to supply him and his business with an old manufacturing facility at an airport that was sort of mostly disused but still a government asset. And he basically ended up claiming that he was employing a lot of quite experienced people who then brought into a board meeting. And then, anyway, turns out that actually investor never invested, there was no money, and the investor kept on finding excuses not to do this. And you also had a number of people, including the person that he employed as his COO, letting that investor for a period of months live at his house because the investor / CEO of this business had claimed that they'd had issues with transferring money across, and actually everyone had been buying into this whole charade, basically. Where do you want to start?
I mean, it starts so promisingly, doesn't it? I think you know, if you've had an introduction through sort of a government official, that brings with it sort of an air of credibility. You know, public servants don't tend to stick their neck on the line unless, you know, the person that they're recommending has a proven track record. I think, you know, these founders were, I guess, unlucky that they've had an introduction through government and it happens to be a bit of a charlatan in the end. Everyone's obviously been hoodwinked, but, you know, you'd like to think that if that's where the introductions come from, it's trustworthy.
Actually, one of the, I think just on that government point, government and individuals within government still have incentives and still can be evidently made to conduct strange behaviors just by, it sounds like there's a promise of investment, like there's an underutilized asset. The government is almost certainly going to be very keen to make sure that investment, as it were, to employ people, sounds like in a very high-end sort of value business. Like this proposed investor's manipulating everyone, right?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I guess. So it's not entirely clear. So the intention was for them to invest in this business and then work together on sort of a joint venture. Because I mean, obviously, it's not really clear what the business that he's potentially investing in does.
So this business was to do with sort of like spatial awareness and sort of virtual reality, essentially. So yeah, and I've been thinking a little bit about this one and just thinking, why is this person doing this? And it feels like almost they're trying to stick two
things
together and sort of generate value from doing that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It sounds like these founders actually didn't go that far down the garden path before they clocked that this investor was not to be trusted or counted on.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to sort of the DD. They were probably obviously hoodwinked by the original investment, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be looking into. I mean, he said him and his wife had made regular investments. It goes back to finding about who else has he invested in, what's he like to work with. I mean, things like source of funds and sort of doing your own deep dive in them to see how credible they actually are beyond what they're saying.
How would you evidence source of funds? So let's say that you're a founder listening. This is a scenario that you might find yourself in either now or in the near future. What does asking for source of funds mean?
I mean, a bank statement goes a long way.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, I suppose you can fairly easily do your diligence in terms of the investments that they've made, especially if they're UK companies. I mean, Companies House was mentioned in this podcast earlier, but you can look into Companies House filings for investments that they've made. You can find out what sort of share price paid, all that sort of stuff, the kind of size of tickets that person potentially has put into previous investments.
Yeah.
That all goes to sort of forming a credible picture about them as an investor.
And is that something that's common for founders to do or to happen within a transaction that you've seen in terms of asking for proof of funds and source of funds?
If they've got no track record, then absolutely, and especially when you're talking about individuals, things like when you're dealing with VCs, obviously you can they'll publicize when they've closed funds, and you can find out in public record who they've made investments in. It's so much more important when you're dealing with individual investors or angels to ask for that evidence, because sort of common theme of this podcast is people getting strung along for such a long time, trusting in what they're being told, and then killing their business. I think it's not unreasonable at the outset, especially if you're dealing with an unproven quantity, to ask for that evidence before you commit your valuable time and resources to pursuing that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you've almost got like a triaging system that you apply in terms of sort of trust but verify, of look through the investments that they've potentially made elsewhere as evidence of previous activity, and that they're credibly going to invest the sort of quantum that you're looking at.
Yeah.
And then in the absence of that evidence, then looking to sort of progress to something like a bank statement that goes across.
Yeah, I guess that they actually have the money to say that they're willing to deploy. I think things even like have the engaged advisors to actually pull the documents together. You know, I would obviously advocate for getting your own advisors engaged as early as possible, but making sure that they've introduced their advisors to your advisors, because sometimes through lawyers you can find out what stage that person's at, whether they've actually engaged another advisor to start producing documentation, because that can be an indication of, well, how far off are we actually here.
Yeah, interesting. An interesting signal. Obviously, from your perspective, that's a clear signal of intent to have advisors engaged.
If they've committed to paying someone's fees, then they're serious about. Well, it's an indication that they're more serious about deploying those funds.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's great. I thought it was a very colourful story to go through, and thankfully, obviously, that these founders, sort of sounds like they went in, very quickly had their eyes opened up, and then didn't sort of bet the house on it.
Yeah, it looks like they trusted their gut, and I mean, by the sounds of things, it hasn't actually impacted the business other than some wasted time.
Yeah, and thankfully not too much. But I think really interesting around government involvement, and it does just sound like the government was being manipulated to everyone, particularly in certain areas where there might be previous assets that are no longer getting used. See the employment that those assets used to create. Governments are always going to have an incentive to want to sort of really make things work. But
creation of jobs, use of government assets, they might be sitting there empty. They might be able to get some rent off the back of. Yeah, you're right. They're incentivized to try and get the cogs going. And
I think, I suppose understanding the motivations of people doing the introductions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Always, something worth considering. Okay. I think we should probably go ahead and give this a review. So just for those that listen to the podcast, we got a 4-tier ranking system. So we've got oddball alert, so which is like the lowest tier. So if someone's a bit of an oddball, if you've got a backseat founder, so if you're engaging with an investor and it basically just sounds like they want to get in and start running the business themselves, you then move up to sort of boardroom vampire. So with your orange card, and that's where if you bring in that investor, for example, into the business, that they're just going to be eating up all the time. So second most severe scenario. And then the last one is a business butcher, where if you accept the terms on offer / the scenario is so bad that it will kill the business by getting involved, then that's the most severe tier. Tom, do you have a rank that you want to give to this one?
I think because the consequences seem to have been fairly innocuous in the end. I'm somewhere between
green and yellow.
I mean, it sounds like potentially the person looked like they wanted to make the investment to become to run the other business, or at least incorporate it in, but it sounded like it was never going to get there. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It sounds like it sounds like the founders were savvy enough, early enough to make sure that they themselves controlled it from being a this, rather than potentially even getting up to this. Because if you get looped in, like that would be the scenario, because others would call out.
Yeah, because I mean, inevitably, if that person had funds, was able to get a sizable chunk of their business, and inevitably the way documents are structured, especially if they become a majority investor, suddenly they're in the driving seat, and that's the end of your business.
Yeah,
especially if they've got these other motivations with this other business they're trying to get off the ground. That could be the end. A
very good choice of words as well with regards to the aviation business. Very good. All right. Okay, we'll move on to story number 2. This is
nice and short one.
Nice and short. Yeah. So makes my job a lot easier. So investor proposing to invest 5K, which reasonably, like, it's not nothing, but it's a reasonably small ticket size. Ended up calling the founders 100 times, and the founders decided to return the 5K. I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You bring in investors ideally to add value.
Yeah.
That's what £50 a call.
Yeah.
And every future call like that value that sum is decreasing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it sounds like an investor that potentially could have caused a massive headache down the line. I think I'm glad that they had the ability to just return the money and there weren't shares issued, because dealing with that would have been an absolute nightmare. But yeah, I mean, their time's more valuable than that. If you've got an overactive investor that has such a significant minority, well, they can't really, in practice, do anything to stop what you want to do. When it comes to raising more money or exit, they could be an absolute nightmare to deal with.
Just I suppose without breaching any confidence, like are there any instances that you've seen of businesses where actually hyperactivity from investors has been really detrimental?
Yeah, I mean, kind of, it happens all the time. You've got investors that maybe have minority stakes, but the documents give them more control over what does and doesn't happen, and you have a disagreement between the founders on what's right for the business. That can run a horse and cart through any progress. You've got deadlock then at potentially at board level, at shareholder level, nothing happens. Once you've fallen out with your investors, and if they're going to act that way and be unreasonable, then that's going to happen. Then that's the end of the business, isn't it? I think more often than not, certainly for the small investors, it's a lack of engagement that causes problems on fundraising and exits, because they just don't engage at all, and then you have to deal with that in a different way.
Let's get into the mechanics there. Why is that so bad?
Well, when you've got stuff you need to, I mean, less so on fundraising, I suppose, because inevitably, if you've got a $5,000 investor, they're probably not going to have enough voting rights to influence the outcome of a round, and you can proceed. And usually documents are structured in a way that, especially if you need to replace equity documents, you can usually vary or terminate them with a particular majority of the shares, and typically the smaller minority inactive investors. That doesn't become a problem. But whenever it comes to, say, exiting and selling, you'll need them to sign something to sell their shares. So there's a backstop in most equity documents you might have heard reference to. It's called a drag along right. So the majority have the right to drag the majority in a sale. They sell ultimately on the same terms, but no buyer ultimately wants to rely on that. You'd rather, you're getting some money, sign the document. But if you've got an investor that thinks that they're not getting enough, and they try and throw whatever little weight they have around, and you're forced to make them sell that way, it adds time, adds cost, complication to a process that people just don't need.
And is that why we often? Is that one of the reasons why we often hear VCs and investors desiring a clean cap table, because it makes those processes easier?
Yeah. The more people you have in the cap table, the more difficult those processes are. Absolutely,
or can be.
Can be, yeah.
Sometimes you can have quite a lot of engaged investors, and
that's true.
We definitely, we do. Just for full transparency, we've got quite a number of angels, and we definitely see that as a good thing. I guess we're quite lucky that they're all quite engaged.
Yeah.
So when it comes to signing things, it's not detrimental. I don't know where to put this one. I mean, oddball alert for me.
Oddball alert. Managed to get rid of them before it became a problem, sounds like.
That's true, yeah. And wise enough to realise that 100 calls is it's odd, the parallels between investors and partners or prospective partners in terms of what constitutes a warning flag. 100 calls in quick succession is probably, is enough to break down any relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So story number 3. And this one is really, I think it's very odd. So speaking to an investor at an event, so they've got 20 billion to deploy across sort of special impact venture capital projects. And I think even just from like the wording, it sounds kind of interesting. So upon questioning said investor, was an investor. They basically couldn't give a straight answer to anything and didn't really show any understanding of what venture capital was. And so, yeah, kept on being pushed for, actually in this instance, the founder was savvy enough to push for source of funds, and the investor didn't really give a straight answer. 1 week it was from a global church with significantly deep pockets, and the next it was from national government. And then, safe to say, in this particular instance, the founder didn't pursue it any further. Have you come across founders that have sort of fallen for this type of stuff where, yeah, there are investors purporting to do these sorts of things?
Yeah, these people were obviously savvy enough to realize these claims were outlandish, and they didn't have the evidence to sort of back up their claims. But when you're in fundraising mode and someone says they've got 20 billion to deploy, and you're looking for obviously a significantly smaller sum than that, and they're telling you all the right things. You can be desperate to get that money, and and you can fall for this and be led down the rabbit hole. And I think especially if you're not savvy enough to sort of, you're too green to understand that what they're saying doesn't stack up, then you can waste so much time, and then when the money inevitably doesn't arrive, that's the end of your business.
I suppose, like, in theory, if the founder didn't know enough about the industry, about the type of terminology used, etc., etc., like, these all sound plausible. Like, global churches do take in a lot of money potentially. National governments also potentially deploy across these.
You talk about sort of special impact or social impact. Those are the kind of funds that churches are going to sort of potentially invest in, or governments are going to support. So.
And I guess, is that an area that you find yourself having to get involved in terms of when you're speaking with businesses and you're sort of saying, well, actually, look, we see this elsewhere, and the company they're potentially green, they're potentially going through it for the first time. Is that something that you have to get involved in a fair bit?
It's difficult. I suppose the stage that I would typically get involved at is when, I guess, a term sheet is being tabled or other advisors are involved. I suppose at that stage, there's a level of credibility to the investments that I would sort of advise on. But certainly if I was to see this, I would be encouraging them to ask questions and get evidence before committing their time and resources to it, because if someone's got 20 billion to deploy and it's across kind of social impact or special impact, you'd expect plenty of publicity around that. Depends on the government, but if you're talking about sort of
those that might be more usually investing in social impact.
Yeah, you'd expect there to be something around it. And if you can't find, if they're not giving you the evidence and it doesn't exist somewhere in the public realm, then it's not worth your time. And obviously, these founders were sensible enough not to pursue it or waste too much time on it. But certainly, if I had a client that said, "Well, what do you think about this?" it would be raising red flags for me, and I would be telling them they need to get more evidence before they commit any time and resources to it.
That's very sound advice. So yeah, thanks very much, Tom. Where do we want to put this on our scale?
I think we've got another.
It's a hat trick, right?
Yeah, it's a time waster. I think for all of these stories, kind of a happy outcome for the founders in the sense that it's just an anecdote, rather than something that's actually, put them in a really difficult position. So, just I suppose a warning to other founders, and they've lived to tell the story, I guess.
Yeah, which actually I think these stories are actually quite a rarity, I guess, in this case, because vast majority of stories we get, actually there has been significant downside impact to the business. And actually I know with at least one of them, it's because of their advisors getting involved early enough in the process that they were able to sort of like really flush out the truth of the matter.
And I think that helps where, where you are green and you've not necessarily even had an investment round yet, or you might have raised capital from a more established VC and had a very polished process and it's gone well, but then you get approached by someone like this and you don't necessarily know how to broach it. I mean, if you've got investors in your cap table that are established, they're the ones you need to speak to. But if equally, if you've got advisors that you trust, running it by them is absolutely the way to go, because as I said, there's enough red flags here to make anyone skeptical.
Are there particular industries that you see founders being generally more cautious in versus others where you find that actually the founders are a bit more gung-ho?
I mean, founders who were previously professionals or have had careers before or have more on the line, it was necessarily sector lines, but they would tend to be a little bit more cautious or hardened than your being ageist here, I guess, but sort of your younger.
I forgive you, and if not, I can give you the number of a lawyer.
Yeah, no. I guess the naivety of youth, I suppose. But sector wise, I don't think so. No, not in my experience anyway.
Understood. Yeah. So so it can apply to just about anyone, and if you're green, then
if you're green, you're green.
Yeah, and as with all of our cards today, Tom, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. It's been good going through these stories, and looking forward to going through some more with you in future.
Thank you.